My name is Donita Gatherum. I'm the chairman of the Heritage Museum Committee, and it's our privilege to start with this series of lectures about Layton history. For those of you that don't know, this is the first in a series of 8 lectures. Hopefully the topic will be in the Parks and Recreation newsletter that you get with your water bill. And if you didn't get one of these, if you want to go online, you can get something that looks like this. And it looks, if you go to Layton City's website and then go to the museum, it has a topic. It says Centennial. And if you click on Centennial, then you get a listing of all of the lectures that will be held. And hopefully the one a month ahead will be in the water bill every month. And it's a wonderful series. It takes you through the history of Layton and various aspects from its development as a city in 1920. And this is the centennial year until today. And so it's our privilege to start, first of all. Bill said I should introduce the museum board, and quite a few of them are here tonight. And so we'll just, if they're here, do you want to see who they are? Okay, let me find their names in my notes here. As I said, I'm the chairman. Derek Meekham is the board vice chairman. Marie Odom is the board secretary, treasurer, and Christine Murdoch is the secretary. There's Marie. And then the board members are Mary Burnett, Abe Carlsdrew, didn't see Abe, Christine Deppy. We're not doing very well, are we? Barbara Hunt, I saw Barbara come in. Margaret Nelson's here. Stephen Sill, back of the back. LaFay Simmons is here in the front. Deidre Wilco is vacationing in California. And then Harris Adams and then Bill Sanders is the director of the museum. And we're very fortunate to have Bill as the museum director. And so we're going to give a little, very short introduction to Bill. He's a native of Kaysville. And but
I know that's what you're all saying.
But he knows a little about Layton. And he taught journalism at Weber State, and then he worked in the public relations department at Westinghouse Corporation, took an early retirement, returned to this area, and he's been the curator of the Heritage Museum in Layton for 21 years. I hope all of you have been over to the museum at some point in time. If you haven't, your assignment is to get over there tomorrow, because it's well worth seeing. And so we want to start with Bill, and he's going to talk about Layton before it was Layton, and this will introduce us to the beginning of this community. So we'll just turn the time over to Bill.
Thanks, Donita. Appreciate it. Before we start, let me have by raise of hands, how many have lived in Layton over 50 years? Okay, 25 to 50 years. Below 25. Okay, we got a ton of experts in here, so whatever I do, don't believe it if you don't want to. But what we're going to do with this one, we're going to start at the very beginning. So our very first settlers, if you want to call them that, were our Native American friends. We had 2 tribes of Indians who called Layton home for quite a few years. As a matter of fact, you can go back in history to the Fremont Indians were in this area several thousand years ago. But the Shoshones and the the Weber Utes were the 2 tribes that were here when the first white settlers came in. The Shoshones came down into this area from up by Malad, Idaho, and they didn't really consider this their home territory. They just came here in the summer to hunt and fish and gather berries and, foodstuffs for the winter. The Weber Utes came out of Weber Canyon, actually out of Morgan Valley, and then they kind of went along the foothills of the mountains. So their main camps that are still being uncovered now are over on the benches of the mountain over toward Farmington Canyon. So, but the Shoshones were all along Case Creek and Holmes Creek here. At the museum, we're still having people come in who have found Indian artifacts along Case Creek, both to the west of us and to the east of us. So they camped mainly along those areas. One of their main campgrounds was right at the junction of where Fort Lane hits Gordon, and goes down. The power stations on one side of the street, on the east side of the street. The west side of the street, that area of Case Creek, was one of their major camps. And so there's still kids that go to Central Davis Junior High School are always running up and down that creek right there, and they bring artifacts all the time into the museum, arrowheads and pieces of pottery and everything. So that's really how our community started. And the trails and everything that have turned into roads now were mainly some of those that the Native Americans, traveled before the white settlers got here. When the early white pioneers came into the Salt Lake Valley, Brigham Young immediately sent scouts out to what is now Davis County to look at the land and see what the possibilities of that land were. And as they came into Davis County, they ran across these three major streams. The first one was called Hates Creek, which is still called Hates Creek now. And then there's Holmes Creek, and there's actually two forks of Holmes Creek. And at the time the Stansbury map was made in 1851, Case Creek was really called Phillips Creek. We'll talk about Phillips in just a minute. But those were the three main water sources. And then, of course, in this desert climate area, water was of primary importance to all of these first settlers. And down toward the lake bottom, there were quite a few artesian wells. And the little drawing at the bottom there shows you how the water coming off the top of the mountains flows down into a stream and then can be tapped for wells, or some of it coming up in artesian wells where it flows freely. So these are what they found. Case Creek was quite at that time was an amazing stream, and it had a lot of water, so it had great potential. The first pioneers came in 1847, and the first settler of what is now northern Davis County was Hector Haight. When they came in 1847 into Salt Lake, they divided all their stock into a couple of different herds, and they sent Peregrine Sessions and Hector Haight out to what is now Davis County. So Peregrine Sessions went into what is Bountiful today, and the herd got too big for them to manage. So they split it in half, and Hector Haight took the second part of the herd and brought it down to what is now Hates Creek. If you go over to Caseville now on Sunset Drive, where it runs into Hates Creek, that's where Hector Haight's first cabin was, and that would have been the first home built by white people in our area. And when they came in the middle of July, Hates Creek was probably running at about half volume because the snow had probably already melted. So it was impressive as a stream, but they didn't know whether it would be enough to really support settlement in this area. But they found that they would be pretty good. So the first three white pioneers of our city of Layton were Edward Phillips, John Green, and William Kay. Now Edward Phillips and John Green were brothers-in-law. Edward Phillips's wife, Susanna, was a sister to John Green. And then Phillips and Green came in they came in 1848 into Salt Lake Valley, stayed in Salt Lake for the first winter, and then in the fall of 1849, they were looking for a place to settle. So they decided to go to Ogden, which was called Brown's Ford at that time. And it was at the fall of the year, and so they got as far as the Sandridge, which is Hill Air Force Base. You know, the big sand pile we call Hill Air Force Base. And they couldn't go any further because their wagons sunk into the sand and everything. So they turned around and went back to what is now Kaysville, to Hates Creek. And there was a man already living there, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and they stayed overnight with him. And he told them, he said, well, my cabin is on Holmes Creek. Well, it was named after him. But he said, just to the north of us, there's this other creek that should be really great for settling, because the stream is not so far down, the banks of the stream are not so high that you can dam it up and build some ditches and dams and water your crops and everything. So Phillips and Green then went back to Salt Lake, but in the spring of 1850, in April of 1850, they came back out to what is now Case Creek. The Angel Street and Case Creek, where you go down to Angel Street and you cross over Case Creek. Phillips was on the west side of what is now Angel Street. Kay was the first house on the north side of Angel Street along Case Creek. And then John Green was another 20 acres up. So they all started to settle on that lower part of Case Creek. And then the big joke is that we should be Phillipsburg or Phillipsville, because Edward Phillips was the first settler. And William Kay came a day later than these two other guys. But they had all known each other in England, and they had known each other in Nauvoo. So they were pretty close friends. And when you got all their families together, there were 21 people in total. And Edward Phillips's mother, Mary Ann Presty Phillips, was a major midwife. And so she was one of the most valuable settlers that they had in this early community. And then we still have preserved some of their cabins. The cabin with the flag on this side, that's the William K. cabin. It's still in existence. It was moved from Kaysville over to Syracuse many years ago by the Wilcox family, and then they donated it to the Syracuse Museum. And sitting next to our museum over here is the Hill cabin, which is probably the second oldest surviving pioneer cabin. And it was down on the lower part of Layton, but was moved up to the museum when J. and Odessa Harris house was taken for the new Legacy Highway. And in the picture you can see there is an 1875 drawing by Edward Phillips's daughter. And so that's what Edward Phillips's cabin looked like for the first years. And that cabin was added to and made into a home and was taken down in 2012. The house finally went down. Now in 1851, they had quite a few settlers that come in that first year, 1850 through January of 1851. So Brigham Young came out to create a LDS ward. And so he called William Kay to be the bishop with Edward Phillips and John Green as counselors. And so the area became known as Kay's Ward. And if you look at this map, this is what Kay's Ward covered. It went all the way from Hates Creek, which is now the border between Farmington and Kaysville, all the way to the Weber River. And so we have 7 communities in that area right now. But it was a large territorial area. So if Kaysville had stayed the same size that Kay's Ward was laid out originally, it would be the largest geographical city in the state of Utah. But we have 7 communities now in that space. So William Kay was the bishop up until 1856, and then he was called to go to Nevada to colonize over near Carson City, Nevada. And so they'd lost their bishop, and so they called another bishop. So from 1856 to 1868, they changed the name from Kay's Ward to Freedom. And then the legend is that One day Brigham Young came out and made a tour of the area, and they were talking about their new settlement, instead of being Kay's Ward, was Freedom. And Brigham apparently made the comment, when did Kay's Ward get its freedom? And so they took that to mean that Brigham didn't like the name of Freedom. So then when they incorporated in 1868, they changed the name to Kaysville. So Kaysville was the first city in Davis County to incorporate. And when they originally incorporated, it included 5 square miles from the center of what is now Kaysville. And then in 1872, they annexed another several acres. And by 1875, Kaysville City was 23 square miles. So it took in everything from here to from Kaysville to the Weaver River. So the differences between Layton and Kaysville that developed in historical time after this, it was a no-win solution from the very beginning, because you had a community established in Kaysville, and then you had all these outlying farms and everything. But for 23 square miles, all of those outlying farms were part of Kaysville City. So Kaysville started their tax system and their business license system. So all of those people who were in that unincorporated kind of area were taxed by the city of Kaysville. And then the social center of this whole area for Kay's Ward was in Kaysville. And this is an artist's rendition of the first adobe meeting house that they had in Kaysville. This would have been right across the street in the parking lot west of where the Kaysville Tabernacle is today. It was right on that corner. So this is the religious and social center of this vast area of Kay's Ward. So if you're LDS and you were living to the north end of what is now Layton, you had to travel all the way over to Kaysville to go to church. So their attendance was not spectacular in the first few years that they were a ward over there. And then this building had a basement. It had 4 rooms in the basement. One room was designated as a school room, and then one room was a social hall where they held dances and parties and everything. And then they had a room for a bishop's storehouse where they collected food for the poor. And then there was just a small bishop's office in it. So this little building was the social center of everything that was there. And these 2 maps show you the difference between Kaysville and Layton. Layton is the only city in Davis County that was not developed on the Mormon grid system. In 1854, the surveyor came out to what is now Kaysville, Jesse Fox, and he laid out a city based on Joseph Smith's grid plan. So there in Kaysville, there were 10 blocks going east and west, and 5 blocks going north and south on the grid system. So they laid out all of these roads and everything immediately. Well, they were just lanes, in those days, but they laid it out so that when the settlers came in and built a cabin or built a home, they could build it on one of the square blocks. But as you see the other one on this side over here, Layton developed by all these pioneers coming in and putting their farm down along one of the major streams. So you had a whole series of people who settled on Case Creek, both west of Angel Street where it all began and east of Angel. So they all settled as close to the water source as they could get. And then there were, in Layton, what is now Layton today, the 2 forks of Holmes Creek. The South Fork comes right down through Kaysville City, but the North Fork is now what is in Layton, Rosewood Lane area. So you had a whole bunch of these settlers settling up there. So they had no structure of an organized city. Layton has never had, in all of its 100 years, a central residential core. If you were a planner today, probably urban planning, you would call Layton a neighborhood community. because when they came in, they settled in different little neighborhoods. And then when they started building subdivisions and everything, there was no central core of residential homes. So they laid out their subdivisions either the north, south, east, or west of Main Street. And then the road system, instead of being on a square grid like Hayesville, Bountiful, Centerville, and Farmington, you had Main Street going down this way. That was the old Territorial Highway. That was Highway number 1, they called it, from Salt Lake to Ogden. And so that was the main artery. And then you had a street that grew up along Fiddler's Creek, which is now Rosewood Lane, connecting with east part of Gentile Street, going up toward the Highway 89 in the east part of the city. And then you had another little lane that developed called Church Street, and Church Street came down and hit Main Street. So on Main Street, east of Main Street, it was Church Street, going all the way up to where Hillfield is today. And then below Main Street, Church Street, was Weaver Lane. And so Weaver Lane goes west and connects with Angel Street. And you only had one artery going north and south, and that was Fort Lane. And Fort Lane was really an Indian Native American trail that went, and eventually Fort Lane went up around Hillfield and over the Sand Ridge and down into South Weber. So it was a major artery to go that way. But there's no grid system here. You've got all these people, you know, putting their farms along all these creeks and everything, and then using these roadways. We had Easy Street. Anybody know what Easy Street is today? Somebody's got it. Steve, you got to know that.
Hillfield Road.
Hillfield Road was called Easy Street. So you had Gentile Street west of Main Street a little bit, and then you had Gordon Avenue really from Fort Lane going west a little bit, and then you had Antelope Drive, which was called the Syracuse Road back in the 70s after Syracuse was developed. So you have all these, it's kind of just a spread out area. And here are some of the pioneers. The Dawsons settled up east of Layton. The Carloses were down on Case Creek about the middle of it. The Forbeses were really pioneers. They were up at the top, just almost where Hillfield is today. And the Hills, this is Joseph Hill and his wife. This is the cabin we have. They were the owners of the cabin we have. And they were down on the west side, almost to the lake. And then you have the Nalders, that were a prominent family. They're kind of in the middle. And then the Robbinses were on the west side. And Elias Adams was up on the northeast side. So were the Thornleys. And then the Harrises were kind of in the middle too. But these are all the major prominent families. Anybody related to anybody of these here? Who's related to Elias Adams? There's a million of you everywhere. So then Thomas Evans was the first pioneer to die in this area, and he was the first man to be buried in what's now the Kaysville Cemetery. So he came and died about a year after he got here. Okay, between 1850 and 1870, if you were a pioneer, came in between 1850 and 1870, you laid out your 20 acres. There's nobody sitting on this spot, so I'm going to take this 20 acres. So you walked off your 20 acres and put some stakes in each of the corners of your 20-acre plot, or you build a little stone monument or something to indicate your land. But that was just squatters. There were no titles or anything. They just came in and settled where they could, where the available land was. But then in 1869, the federal government brought in the title area, so you had to have a title to your land. So you can see in this map the people who took up either a full section of land or a quarter section of land. that they could actually go down to Farmington and get a title for that land. So they had a title in their hand that made them the owners of that property. So that's not necessarily everybody getting a title, because you had some of these people from the 50 to 70 period who just came in and laid out their own land. So there were a few land disputes over time about different boundaries of different people. And of course, we can appreciate this today, but this was an agricultural area from 1850 to 1950. It was primary agricultural. When was the last time you drove around Layton and saw an animal in a field? Anybody done that in the last month or two? You can't find an animal in Layton anymore. You got to search really hard to find one. But it's amazing to think that they raised thousands and thousands of sheep in this area, in what is now Layton. The kind of the rule of thumb was every farmer should have at least 30 sheep. And every farmer should have at least 20 to 30 cows, beef cattle. And then we never think of it today about people actually in our pioneer time raising horses, both work horses and saddle horses. But in Layton, that was big business in the early years. And they used to come, the federal government cavalrymen used to come to Layton up until 1917 to buy saddle horses from the farmers in Layton. And there were several breeds of animals, of saddle horses, that were very prominent in this area. And the farmers who had those horses, they raised 30 or 40 head of them every year and could sell them to the federal government for cavalry horses. And then look at the size of the pumpkins in this picture. Have you ever grown a pumpkin that big and could walk through your wheat field and the wheat was as high as your shoulders? And so what we had here was we had all these streams with the water, but between those streams you had a lot of open land. And the only thing you could do with that open land if you didn't have water was to dry farm. So wheat products were important. The cereal grains were really important to most of the farmers of this area. And then we raised pigs and, of course, beef cattle. And there was a dairy industry here in Layton in the very early years, but it never got to be as huge as the cattle and sheep business. Hiram Adams at one time, they figured they could get 30 head of cattle in one railroad car. And at one time, Hiram Adams had 256 rail cars, 30 animals in each of those rail cars. And he did that every year for about, almost 25 years. So it was really big business. We just don't appreciate today how big that was. But every farm had their horses and their cows and their pigs and chickens and then their vegetable gardens and everything which they raised. And then the world of pioneer times changed in 1870. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad came in. We celebrated that 150th anniversary last year. But Brigham Young wanted the railroad to come down into Salt Lake, but they decided to come down Weber Canyon instead of into Salt Lake. So immediately after the Golden Spike was driven in 1869, Brigham put together a company to be able to build a railroad from Ogden to Salt Lake, and then eventually to Provo, and he was hoping to go all the way down to St. George, but it never quite made that. And so in 1870, you had the Utah Central Railroad come through Layton. And what they did was they followed the territorial highway from Layton throughout to into Ogden. And so Layton's Main Street had a railroad track, came right down the west side of the main street in Layton. And if you wonder why the street is so wide today, Main Street, is because the west side of the street was the railroad tracks. Their company they made a subsidiary called the Oregon Short Line, and it went off from the middle of Wyoming up to Portland, Oregon. But it was like a subsidiary of Union Pacific. So they kept the Oregon Short Line until Union Pacific could get solvent again. So in 1878, the Oregon Short Line bought the Utah Central. So for many years here in Layton, it was the Oregon Short Line Railroad. And then in 1939, it became Union Pacific. So Union Pacific wanted to be. Anybody in here rode the Bamberger? I know there's bunches of people who rode the Bamberger. So the Bamberger was a interurban tracks kind of railroad that went from Salt Lake to Ogden. And it went through, it was completed between Ogden and Salt Lake in 1908, but it reached Layton in 1906. And the terminal was right down here, across on Gentile Street, just about where you'd start going up over the bridge. You know, where Gentile Street Bridge goes, it was just to the south of that. That's where the train station was here. And this is the Union Pacific Oregon Short Line. This was built many years after 1870. But this little station sat right at the junction of Main and Gentile Street. And so the signal was there. They dropped down the signal if they wanted the train to stop. And then this was there for many years. And then when they moved the tracks in 1912 back to where they are today, they moved this little building to the west. Now, if you were a pioneer of the Layton area from 1850 on, and you wanted to go to a store after 1868 really, you had to go to Kaysville to go to a store, because Brigham Young started the Cooperative Institute. It was the ZCMI, was the starting foundership of Brigham's idea. He didn't want Mormon money to go out to any of the Gentile people who were coming into Salt Lake. So they started these cooperative stores. There was no competition to the Kaysville Cooperative Mercantile Institution. The two other business people in Kaysville who were in business before the cooperative movement started, they had to fold their merchandise and everything into the co-op. So if you wanted to buy something, you had to go from Layton area, hitch up your buggy or get on your horse, go over to Kaysville to shop from 1868 to 1882. So you're limited. If you didn't like Mr. Barnes at the Kaysville Co-op, you had an alternative. You could go to Ogden and you could buy your stuff in Ogden. But those were the only two places to be able to shop. And then after Brigham Young died, the cooperative movement just fell apart almost immediately. As a matter of fact, there was a group of guys from Ogden, Burton, Herrick, and White, and they came in to Layton and built a little tiny wooden store on Main Street in Main and Gentile in 1876. And Brigham Young didn't die till 1877, so they snuck that in really fast. And then in 1882, Christopher Layton started what was called the Kaysville Farmers Union Store. See the picture of the Farmers Union down at the bottom? There's a little wooden building sitting next to it. Christopher Layton actually built that little building over in Kaysville. He moved up from two locations in Kaysville, from down by where the railroad depot was in Kaysville, up to Kaysville's Main Street. And then in 1882, he brought it out here and started the Farmers Union. And then later on, the Farmers Union, they built the brick building, which is today the bank, First Community Bank. And then in 1882, two people came in at the same time. Barton and Company came in. They were Kaysville people. They came in and they bought out the Burton, Herrick, and White people. And then a few months later, Barton and Company was bought out by Adams and Sons Market. So all three of these locations were in the same location until Adams and Sons built the bigger brick store later on. And so this is the beginning of business in Layton. And these were stores that you had to drive to. Again, you have no central residential core. So there was no people in Layton to walk to the Farmers Union. If you wanted to go to the Farmers Union, you hitched up your buggy or got on your horse and went to the Farmers Union. Between where the Bamberger Railroad tracks were right up here, the two east lanes of I-15 and the railroad tracks to the west of us, there were 30 houses in the first 56 years of Layton's existence. So out of those 30 houses, they were the only people who could actually walk to one of the main street stores. The rest of the people came from East Layton or West Layton, to shop at these different places. And then further development in 1904, Arthur Ellis store was started. And then 1905, the First National Bank was started. It lasted for over 100 years. And then 1909, Ernest Layton Hardware store was built. And then in 1909, the Layton Drug Company came in. Now all of these businesses are on the east and west side of Main Street, going to north of Gentile and a little bit to the south of Gentile. And then when you think about education, how you're a pioneer, you come in, you want your kids to be educated. Well, where do you send them to school? So if I was living in a house in Layton, my farm was right here where I'm sitting today, I had two options. I could send my kids over to Kaysville, to the Kaysville Meeting House. They could go to school over there. Or I could send them one of the one-room schoolhouses that were built out here. Over the years, there were 8 one-room schoolhouses built throughout what is now Layton. Several to the east of us and 2 or 3 to the west of us. The Dawson Hollow School was to the east of us, and the 5 Point School was over on Rosewood Lane, where Rosewood Lane goes into Main Street. But that were the only educational options for the first 50 years of Layton's existence. If you wanted your kids educated, you either sent them to the one-room schoolhouse here, or you got them to Kaysville somehow. And then Kaysville took their square block grid system, took one block out of that grid system and built their grade school in the middle of that one block. So in the grid system, all the kids living in the grid system could walk to school. And your only problem was busing or getting the kids that lived in West Kaysville or East Kaysville to school every morning. But in Layton, it was a much, much harder, really, thing to get kids to school, even to the one-room schoolhouses, because they were not necessarily convenient to where they were actually living. And in the early years, all a teacher had to do was be able to walk and talk. They didn't have to have any education. They could just, say, I want to be a school teacher, and I'm a school teacher. And for the first few years, they were all paid in bartered goods. They'd either get vegetables or meat or whatever for their thing. And it was a very short school year because of the farm demands of the area. And then an interesting phenomenon happened in the 1880s. The 1880s were in LDS history was the big polygamy era. So there were a lot of polygamists. Christopher Layton and his 10 wives and 65 children, they were in this area. So the Protestant churches in the eastern United States decided, hey, we want to wean those Mormon kids back into true religion. So most of the LDS converts from England were Episcopalian. They had been members of the Church of England before they were converted to the Mormon Church. So the Episcopalian Church thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll come out to Utah, and in all these polygamy communities, we will start a church and a school. But our church and the school will be tremendously superior to anything that the education system in Utah would offer. So every one of these Protestant churches came into the area. The two surviving things now, there's the little Presbyterian church that's still over in Kaysville. And then you had Mount Pleasant Academy, which is still there. And then Westminster College and Rowland Hall in Salt Lake are the only surviving part of that Protestant religious push. Their thought was they could have a school of about 30 kids, 30 to 35 kids. They would hire a very well-qualified teacher who had graduated from an Eastern college or an Eastern teaching seminary, and they'd bring him out here and they would teach the school kids. And so in Layton you had the Reverend, well, he actually wasn't a reverend. They called him Reverend Henry Ellis. He was a lay preacher. He wasn't an ordained minister for the Episcopal Church. But he came in and he started St. Jude's. And St. Jude's Episcopal Church was the first church building built in what is now Layton. It was right where the Layton Elementary School is today. And it was there from 1888 until 1900. And then in 1900 they had a small fire in the building. It didn't destroy the building, but it, messed it up pretty much. So Reverend Ellis moved up onto Main Street. He bought the old William Hyde grocery store and turned it into the Episcopal Church on Main Street. There were 4 members of the Episcopal Church who went to this church, both when it was down on Gentile Street where the grade school is and was up on Main Street. But the Episcopal Church authorities, both in Ogden and Salt Lake, felt that they would still keep these, even though they didn't have a big population of their own church members, they would still keep the schools going. So it didn't take very long for the people in Layton to realize, if I want my kid really well educated, I send him to the St. Jude's Mission School, not to the one-room schoolhouse or not to the Kaysville Elementary School. I send them to one of these Protestant schools because the teachers are just superior teachers. So there's a lot of Layton old-timers who were educated at the St. Jude Mission School. And then in 1890, the Utah legislature passed the Utah Public School System Act, and that meant everybody had to go to school. So they started the Layton Elementary School, and this building you can see here was built in 1902. Joseph Sill was the first principal. He taught the higher grades, and then May Gibson was the primary grades, the kindergarten through 6th grade. And then Sill taught the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th type thing. So where you've got all these farmers living all over on the scattered all throughout Layton. So where are you going to build your elementary school? Where do you decide to put it? It's not going to be in a residential area. It's going to be somewhere. So you got to make it fairly about halfway between east and west. So what do? You put it on Gentile Street, where the elementary school is today, Layton Elementary School. And then still, 90% of the kids going to Layton Elementary School in 1902 to probably 1915 had to be bused there. They had wagons that they would bring them in, and they had open wagons in the spring and fall, and then covered wagons to bring the kids in the wintertime. But you had to transport your kids to this school. And then the people had to pay for that, out of their own pocket. Because the school system could say, okay, we're going to build you the building, but we can't pay for transportation, to get your kids to school. So the Layton residents saw a lot of taxes and a lot of out-of-pocket expenses that many of the cities of Bountiful, Centerville, Farmington, and Kaysville, because they were gridded systems, did not ever see. So the people in Layton had to pay a lot of money out of their own pockets. And then if you wanted to go to higher education, which we would term today high school, you could go from 1889 to 1914 to the Kaysville Academy. That's the picture on the bottom. And that was, they taught 9th through 12th grades there. And many years there, they would have 3 to 5 students in each one of those grades. But the Kaysville Academy was actually an LDS church school. They put them in all over in the late 1900s. And so the Kaysville Academy was actually owned by the Kaysville First Ward. And they ran it from 1889 until 1914. And then Davis County High School was built in 1914. So all the students from Layton between 1914 and 1968 had to go to Davis High School. And then in 66 we started Layton High School over here with their first graduating class, coming after that. But the last year for Layton kids to graduate in the 12th grade at Davis was 1968. So we got a lot of Davis darts in here. And then Layton was kind of floating around a title for this area. It was called Case Creek for a long time because of the Case Creek going, and then it was called Case Crossing for a few years because where Gentile and Main Street made this X crossing, they called it Case Crossing. But then in 1886, they petitioned the federal government for a post office, and they submitted several names before the name of Layton was actually chosen. They had submitted a name called Thornley. They submitted a name called Adams. Well, those were after prominent people. But old Christopher got the nod, so they named it after Christopher Layton. The guy who Layton is named after, who never lived in Layton, but lived in Kaysville all of his life, and then Arizona and Kaysville all his life, but we're named after him. Now, the separation of Layton and Kaysville, we've got another lecture which will cover this in great detail, so I'll just skip over it. But in 1889, the Kaysville City Council decided they wanted to go, for the first time in their history, they were going to go into debt, and they were going to build a city hall. So that meant that they didn't have money to build that city hall. They would have to bond for that, and so they would have to find some nice ways to pay for the bond, and that was by taxes. So they decided that they would have a business license tax. They would raise the basic taxes of all the residents of what was then Kaysville, and that they would try to do the major improvements. Roads needed to be improved, education needed to be improved, culinary water systems needed to be put in, sewer systems needed to be put in, and the police and fire were really in question. So what did they do? The Kaysville City Council? They decided to build a city hall instead of improve roads and fix the police department and do these other things. So they taxed the people who are living in Layton. Now remember, Kaysville City is sitting over here, and it has a 23-mile radius going around that thing. So you live at the end of the 23 miles, you're going to be taxed in order to build this building. Would you be happy about that? And then the other thing was, after they finally started the Kaysville City Hall construction, it just sparked a whole bunch of protests, not only from the people who were living in the Layton area, but also from people in Kaysville, because people in Kaysville didn't want to go in debt to build this city hall. So they protested. But then we had two gentlemen out here in Layton, Rufus Adams and E.P. Ellison, who absolutely refused to pay taxes. Both of them, both income taxes as well as business license taxes. So both of them were major store owners. E.P. Ellison has the Farmers Union. Rufus Adams has the Adams and Sons Market. So they decide, we're going to fight this taxation without representation by not paying our taxes. So they didn't pay their taxes. So the city marshal of Kaysville comes out to Layton, stops at E.P. Ellison's house, and hooks up his wagon, brand new wagon he just purchased, and takes it back to Kaysville as payment for his taxes. So EP then goes to court against Linford, John Linford, who was the tax collector of Kaysville. So their first separation lawsuit happened between E.P. Ellison and Linford over this wagon instance. And then the rest of the people in Layton, kind of followed suit. I'm not gonna pay. How far out of Layton, out of Kaysville City's grid system, can they actually really tax me? Because I don't get any police service out here. The fire department, voluntary fire department of Kaysville, my barn out here could burn down before they even got together and started for Layton. So they all really went against the tax situation. And the poor guy in the middle was John W. Thornley, the guy in this. John W. Thornley was a Layton resident, but he was also on the Kaysville City Council. So he was the guy that was actually put in the middle of all this stuff. He had voted against the building of the city hall, but he was overruled, and so he had to take flack from both the people living in Layton and the people living in Kaysville as well. And the court battle lasted for 4 years. Actually, it had lasted from 1889 to 1902, but the actual court thing was a 4-year period where they sued each other back and forth for different kind of things. Those of you who are LDS will find this interesting. E.P. Ellison was the first counselor in the Davis Stake presidency. John W. Linford and the guys he was suing over in Kaysville were on the High Council. So during the week, from Monday through Friday, they went to court suing each other. And then on Sunday, they got together to run their Sunday business, their church business. Really kind of weird. And that got to such a point that people started to talk about it, Here are these guys, suing each other over this city business during the week. And then they're supposed to conduct their church business and all be friends, So they even called in 3 general authorities, 3 apostles had to come in. They had a mass meeting over in Kaysville saying, okay, now you're in this lawsuit business here, but do you have any ill feelings toward E.P. Ellison? And so they had to iron out all their differences in the court. And then the other thing that broke the camel's back is the certificate that you can see at the top there. That's a dog license. They slapped a $1 dog license on every citizen living in Layton. Hiram Adams got really upset. He had 4 dogs because he was a sheep man. And those 4 dogs were essential to his business, He needed sheepdogs to keep the coyotes and things away from his sheep herds and everything. So now Kaysville wants him to pay $4 to get a dog license for each of these dogs. And he refused to pay that. And think about what $4 in 1889 money would have been. It would have been a considerable amount of money. My dog has never been on Kaysville's Main Street. It's never been off my farm. Doesn't wander around, and it's essential to my business. So that was another big thing that they really did. And then we had an interesting phenomenon happen after the railroad came in. These big businesses could be started because the railroad was here to not only bring in stuff, wheat to be processed at the roller mill, but it could bring in fruits and vegetables to be canned at the canning company. In 1890, E.P. Ellison and a guy named Gibson got together, decided that they were going to build a flour mill here for the production of flour. There were already 3 flour mills over in Kaysville, so they wanted some of the business. And it was big business in 1890 to make flour. So they built the Layton roller mills. It was right on Main Street. It's right where the Case Crossing apartment complex is today. And there was a spur off of the main line of the railroad going into the roller mills. And then the Layton Canning Company was started in 1903, and it went for a few years, and then 1912 consolidated with Wood Cross Canning Company. And it lasted for a number of years. And they canned peas, beans, tomatoes, pumpkin, and a bunch of other vegetable things here in Layton. And the canning company was on Cross Street, just off Main Street. So they were both downtown. And then, of course, in 1915, the Layton Sugar Mill came in. And Layton Sugar Mill coming to Layton changed Davis County forever, because it was a major employer for the entire Davis County area. And the story of how the sugar mill got here, we're going to do that in another one of these lectures in this series. But the Layton Sugar Mill lasted from 1915 to the mid-60s and was a big part of Davis County's economy. This is what Layton looked like, downtown Layton looked like in 1905. The little building, the black building on the side there, that's the railroad depot, and then Adams and Sons Market. But you see this whole area coming up to where we are sitting here. There are no homes, no houses, no central residential district at all. And Layton is an interesting city as it developed up to 1920. It became a really culturally diversified city quite early in its history. When the railroad first came in, we had a number of Greek families coming into Layton who worked for the railroad. Then when the sugar mill came in, we had a number of Japanese families coming in working for the sugar mill. And then when the Bamberger came in, 1906, they also hired quite a few ethnic kind of people. And then the Mexican Americans came in. They came in a little bit later, but they worked on the farms and everything. So Layton has really always had a cultural diversified population for a number of years. This is what Layton downtown looked like 20 years before they incorporated. This picture was actually taken, aerial photo, 1940 of Gentile and Main Street. And at the top of it you can see the White Chapel, which was the LDS meeting house that was right down here at the end of Wasatch. So when they incorporated in May 24th, 1920, this is what the city looked like. They elected Lawrence Ellison, Carol's dad, as the first town board president. And then the board trustees were Briggs King, William Layton, and Leonard Sandel. Excuse me. And then Wilford Wiggle was the clerk, and Bert Cook was the treasurer. E.M. Whiteside was elected as the justice of the peace. And the first town marshal was a guy named Ray Bybee. He didn't have a car to drive in 1920, so he made his police rounds on his horse. And he would go to each of the businesses and check to make sure they were all locked up and everything. But the city couldn't afford a car for him, so he rode his horse. So that's where this is taking you up to 1920. The rest of our series of lectures will take you into all these different things. So